"Who are you?" the MIT judge asked the janitor directly. The entire Harvard lecture hall fell silent, chalk dust settling as the man in a maintenance uniform straightened his shoulders. 20 years of invisibility fell away as he reclaimed his true identity. "My name is Dr. Moyle Johnson Osei. How did a brilliant mathematician end up scrubbing floors at the very institution that destroyed his career? Why was James, a promising black student, forced to stand during lectures due to a painful secret? And what happens when truth finally emerges after decades of being erased?" Prepare to witness how a single piece of chalk reveals decades of academic theft in "Black Man Was Scorned for Being a Cleaning Staff." Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that expose hard truths and celebrate hidden heroes. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published new stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson moved silently through Harvard's hallowed halls, pushing his janitorial cart with practiced ease. At 45, his salt and pepper beard and stoic demeanor had become as much a fixture of Thayer Hall as the portraits of distinguished alumni lining its walls. Yet despite his 15 years of service, Marcus remained virtually invisible to the students and faculty who passed him daily. "Excuse me," a professor muttered without making eye contact, brushing past Marcus as if he were merely an inconvenient piece of furniture. Marcus nodded politely, continuing his work without comment. He'd long grown accustomed to this particular form of invisibility, the kind reserved for those who served rather than taught or studied. As he entered Lecture Hall B, Marcus noticed Professor Eleanor Whitmore at the board, her chalk scratching furiously as she prepared for her advanced mathematics lecture. Her reputation preceded her, brilliant but cold, with little patience for those she deemed intellectually inferior. "You there," she called without turning. "I need this room spotless before my 2 p.m. class. These undergraduates are paying good money, and I won't have them distracted by someone's coffee stains." "Yes, Professor Whitmore," Marcus replied quietly. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes dismissive. "And please be finished before my students arrive." When she left, Marcus approached the blackboard to clean its margins. His eyes scanned the complex equations, and he paused, noticing an error in her work, a subtle mistake in a differential equation that would lead her students down an incorrect path. For a moment, his hand hovered near the error, chalk dust illuminating his dark fingers. With practiced restraint, he lowered his hand and continued cleaning. It wasn't his place to correct Harvard's esteemed Professor Whitmore. Later, as students filed in, Marcus retreated to a corner with his mop. A young black student entered, walking stiffly and standing at the back rather than taking a seat. "Mr. Carter," Professor Whitmore said sharply. "There are plenty of empty seats. Must you insist on standing like a sentinel?" "I'm sorry, Professor," the young man replied, shifting uncomfortably. "My back." Yes, your mysterious back problems. Take a seat or leave my classroom." Marcus watched as James Carter reluctantly moved toward a seat, his face tight with pain. Something in the young man's eyes, determination shadowed by hurt, stirred a memory in Marcus, something from a life long buried. As Marcus finished his cleaning and headed for the door, he glanced again at the blackboard. The error remained, uncorrected. No one would notice except him. And perhaps that was fitting. Some mistakes, Marcus knew all too well, remained invisible only to those who refused to see. James Carter leaned against the wall at the back of Professor Whitmore's lecture hall, his back throbbing with familiar pain. 6 months had passed since Professor Regina Harris had struck him with a pointer when he'd questioned her analysis of historical racial biases in economic theory. The physical pain had eventually subsided, but the humiliation and resulting injury had left him with chronic back issues that made sitting for long periods unbearable. "Mr. Carter," Professor Whitmore's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "I don't recall giving you special standing privileges in my class." James straightened. "Professor, as I've explained before, I have medical." "Yes, your alleged back condition." Her skepticism hung in the air like chalk dust. "Which conveniently lacks documentation from the University Health Services." The truth was, James had documentation but had chosen not to submit it officially. Doing so would require naming Professor Harris, and as one of the few black students in the economics department, he feared the repercussions. Either join your colleagues in proper seating arrangements or consider yourself marked absent, Professor Whitmore continued, gesturing to an empty seat in the front row. From the corner of his eye, James noticed the janitor, the older black man who always seemed to be cleaning somewhere nearby, pausing in his work, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. With reluctance, James made his way to the indicated seat, each step sending sharp pains up his spine. He lowered himself slowly, jaw clenched against the discomfort. "Now that Mr. Carter has deigned to join us properly," Professor Whitmore said with a thin smile, "let's continue our exploration of Chandrasekhar limits in non-Euclidean spaces." As she turned to the blackboard, James noticed a small error in her preliminary equation. His hand rose hesitantly. "Professor, I think there's a—" "Mr. Carter," she interrupted without turning around, "having finally taken your seat, are you now determined to disrupt my lecture with questions? Perhaps you'd prefer to teach the class yourself?" Scattered laughter rippled through the room. James lowered his hand, his cheeks burning. Later, as students filed out after class, James remained seated, waiting for the pain to subside enough for him to stand. Professor Whitmore gathered her materials, pointedly ignoring him. "You were right," came a quiet voice. James turned to find the janitor cleaning nearby. "About the equation." The man didn't look up from his work, and James wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "Excuse me." "The Chandrasekhar formulation." She dropped a critical coefficient. The janitor's voice was soft but clear. "Changes everything downstream." Before James could respond, Professor Whitmore returned, eyeing them both with suspicion. "Mr. Carter, if you're finished monopolizing the classroom, some of us have research to conduct." James rose painfully, gathering his books. As he left, he glanced back at the janitor, who had resumed his work, once again invisible to everyone but him. In the hallway, he overheard two teaching assistants whispering. "Did you see Whitmore put Carter in his place again? I don't get why she's so hard on him specifically. You know how she is about standards. Probably thinks he's only here because of affirmative action." James tightened his grip on his backpack and walked away, the pain in his back matched only by the one in his chest. Marcus's one-bedroom apartment in Dorchester was modest but meticulously organized. Bookshelves lined every available wall, filled with volumes on advanced mathematics, theoretical physics, and philosophy. A small desk positioned near the window held a worn leather journal and a stack of academic papers, some yellowed with age, others printed recently from online journals he accessed through public library computers. He shed his janitor's uniform and carefully hung it in a closet before showering away the day's chalk dust and floor cleaner. Afterward, dressed in comfortable clothes, Marcus settled at his desk and opened his journal to a fresh page. He sketched Professor Whitmore's erroneous equation, then corrected it, following the mathematical thread to its proper conclusion. His mind wandered to James Carter. There was something familiar in the young man's struggles, the determined set of his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the resignation in his shoulders when dismissed. Marcus had seen that same look in the mirror decades ago. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher, stood holding a covered dish. "Made too much stew again," she said with a knowing smile. They both understood this was her way of checking on him. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson." He accepted the dish, careful to position himself so she couldn't see the mathematics texts visible behind him. "You're too kind." "Nonsense. You working tonight?" she asked, referring to what she believed was his night shift as a security guard, the fiction he maintained to explain his unusual hours. "Not tonight. Catching up on some reading." After she left, Marcus ate while reading an article on recent developments in string theory. His phone chimed with a rare email notification, a mathematical journal announcing a competition at Harvard, sponsored by the prestigious Whitaker Foundation. The prize, a substantial grant and recognition in leading academic circles. Marcus stared at the announcement, memories washing over him like a tide. 20 years ago, he'd been Dr. M.J. Osei, a rising star in theoretical mathematics at the University of Ghana, later earning a position at Imperial College London. His paper on multidimensional calculus had garnered international attention, until it was discredited by prominent American mathematicians who couldn't accept that such innovation could come from an African scholar. The following morning, Marcus quietly entered Harvard's administrative building during his break. Dean Richard Thompson was speaking animatedly with a donor in the hallway, his tailored suit and confident gestures embodying institutional power. "Of course, Harvard maintains the highest standards," the dean was saying. "Our reputation depends on excellence, not accommodation." Marcus kept his head down as he passed, but caught the dean's momentary glance, the reflexive assessment and dismissal that came when Thompson recognized him as merely part of the maintenance staff. Later that day, as Marcus cleaned the mathematics department hallway, he observed Professor Whitmore berating a teaching assistant. "Olivia, these papers are graded too generously," she snapped, thrusting a stack of exams at a young Asian American woman. "We're not running a charity. Either they understand the material or they don't." "But Professor, some students are approaching the problems differently, especially Carter. His solution was unconventional but mathematically sound." "I decide what's sound in my classroom," Whitmore interrupted. "Regrade these. And I want to see at least a 10-point reduction in the average score." After they departed, Marcus approached the classroom where James often studied alone. The young man was standing at the blackboard, attempting to work through a complex problem, his face contorted in both mathematical concentration and physical pain. Marcus silently placed a folded piece of paper on James's backpack and continued down the hallway, his mop creating wet arcs on the floor like mathematical functions seeking their limits. On the paper was a simple note: "Try approaching it from the fourth dimension first. The solution reveals itself when viewed from the proper angle." The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as students prepared for Professor Whitmore's infamous execution day, her term for the midterm review where she dissected each student's understanding with surgical precision and public commentary. James stood at his usual place against the back wall, reviewing his notes. His back had been particularly painful all week, but today he'd come prepared, a doctor's official note requesting accommodation for his condition. "Mr. Carter," Professor Whitmore called as she entered, "I see you're continuing your vertical rebellion." James straightened. "Actually, Professor, I have this." "Spare me," she cut him off, not even looking at the paper he held out. "Today's review requires active participation at the board. Your special arrangements end now." James hesitated, then slowly approached the front, where 3 large blackboards awaited. Professor Whitmore assigned each student a problem, saving what appeared to be the most complex for James. "Derive the complete solution," she instructed with a thin smile. "Show all steps." James recognized the problem. It built upon the very equation Professor Whitmore had presented incorrectly weeks ago, the one the janitor had quietly noted. If he solved it as Whitmore expected, following her flawed premise, the solution would fail. If he corrected the original error, she would accuse him of insubordination. As he worked, the chalk feeling heavy in his hand, James made a decision. He wrote the equation correctly, including the coefficient Whitmore had omitted. The solution flowed naturally after that, revealing elegant symmetries that the flawed version obscured. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Marcus enter with his cleaning cart, beginning his rounds at the back of the hall. "Time," Professor Whitmore announced, approaching each board in turn, offering perfunctory comments until she reached James. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" "Solving the problem correctly, Professor," James replied, standing as straight as his back would allow. "You've altered my original equation. This is unacceptable." "With respect, the original equation was incorrect. This is the proper formulation." A hush fell over the classroom. Professor Whitmore's face hardened. "Your arrogance is breathtaking," she hissed. "This equation as I presented it has been accepted in 4 published papers." "Then those papers contain the same error," James replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Professor Whitmore turned to the class. This is what happens when admission standards are compromised for the sake of diversity. Mr. Carter believes his intuition outweighs established mathematical consensus. James felt heat rising to his face. This isn't about intuition, Professor. It's about mathematical fact. Enough. Whitmore snapped. You've disrupted this review session long enough. Remove yourself from my classroom immediately. And expect this insolence to be reflected in your grade. James gathered his things slowly, pain shooting through his back with each movement. As he reached the door, he looked back, catching Marcus's eye. The older man gave an almost imperceptible nod, not of pity, but of recognition. In the hallway, James leaned against the wall, breathing deeply through the pain and humiliation. A moment later, the door opened again, and Olivia Chen, Professor Whitmore's TA, emerged. James, she said quietly, you were right about the equation. It doesn't matter, he replied bitterly. It matters to the truth, she insisted. And for what it's worth, I've seen our janitor watching when you solve problems. The way he looks at your work, it's like a master chess player analyzing a promising student's game. The campus coffee shop buzzed with afternoon activity as James nursed a cooling cup of coffee. His encounter with Professor Whitmore had left him questioning his future at Harvard. Despite his scholarship and academic record, he felt increasingly unwelcome in spaces where people like him were rarities. Mind if I join you? James looked up to find Marcus standing beside his table, out of his usual janitor's uniform and instead wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt. Please, James gestured to the empty chair, surprised at the transformation. Without his uniform, Marcus carried himself differently, his shoulders squared, his gaze direct. Your solution was elegant, Marcus said without preamble. The coefficient correction was just the beginning. You took it somewhere unexpected. James studied him. You understand advanced theoretical mathematics. I do. A simple statement of fact, without pride or explanation. Why are you working as a janitor? Marcus finished with a slight smile. Sometimes life takes unexpected turns. They sat in silence for a moment before Marcus continued. I was watching you work. Your approach reminds me of a mathematician I knew in Ghana. Creative, intuitive. You're from Ghana? Marcus nodded. I was born in Kumasi. Studied there before receiving a scholarship to Imperial College London. James leaned forward. So you were a student of mathematics? A shadow crossed Marcus's face. More than a student. I was Dr. M.J. Osei. I published several papers on multidimensional calculus applications before. He trailed off. Before what? Before I learned that brilliance has different values depending on its source. Marcus's voice was matter of fact, but James recognized the underlying pain. My work was discredited by prominent American mathematicians who couldn't accept its origins. That's why you recognize Whitmore's errors, James realized. You've been following her work. I follow all significant mathematical publications, Marcus corrected him. Old habits. Why don't you say something? Publish a correction? Marcus gave him a knowing look. Who would listen to a janitor? James understood then, the invisibility that protected Marcus also silenced him. The mathematics competition, James said suddenly. The Whitaker Foundation is sponsoring it next month. Whitmore's making it mandatory for her students. With your knowledge, I could. No, Marcus interrupted firmly. I don't seek the spotlight anymore. But you could mentor me, James pressed. Not publicly. Just, guidance. Marcus seemed to consider this. Mathematics was once my life's passion. Perhaps it still is. Will you help me? James asked. Outside the window, students passed by, oblivious to the extraordinary conversation taking place just feet away. Marcus looked at his hands, strong, calloused from years of manual labor, yet still possessing the precision that had once traced breakthrough equations. Yes, he said finally. But with conditions. Our arrangement remains private. And you must understand, I can open doors to mathematical understanding, but I cannot open doors locked by prejudice. James nodded, for the first time in months feeling something like hope. We begin tomorrow, Marcus said, rising from his chair. And James? The pain in your back, have you sought proper treatment? Doctors say it's partly psychosomatic now, James admitted. From anxiety about being in classrooms. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps solving the right equations will help heal more than your academic standing. The basement room of Widener Library was rarely used, making it perfect for James and Marcus's clandestine tutoring sessions. 3 weeks had passed since they'd begun meeting, and the Whittaker mathematics competition loomed just days away. I'm still struggling with the Riemann applications, James admitted, rubbing his eyes after 2 hours of intense work. Marcus stepped to the blackboard they'd uncovered in the storage room. You're approaching it conventionally. Remember what I told you about mathematical intuition? That it's not mystical, but recognition of patterns we haven't consciously processed yet, James recited. Exactly. Look at this problem from a different perspective. Marcus began writing, his chalk strokes confident and precise. There's a pathway here not found in standard textbooks. The door creaked open suddenly, and they froze. Professor Whitmore stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from surprise to smug amusement. Well, she drawled, stepping into the room. Mr. Carter has found himself a most unusual tutor. James straightened. Professor Whitmore. The janitorial staff giving mathematics lessons, she continued, ignoring James. How quaint. Does Dean Thompson know you're using university facilities for unauthorized tutoring, Mr.? She paused, realizing she'd never bothered to learn Marcus's name. Johnson, Marcus supplied quietly. Marcus Johnson. Mr. Johnson should be emptying trash bins, not filling students' heads with mathematical nonsense. She examined the blackboard with a dismissive glance. What is this supposed to be? Some kind of alternative approach to Riemann surfaces? It's a valid solution pathway, James defended. I highly doubt that, Whitmore scoffed. Mr. Carter, as a scholarship student, you should understand your precarious position. Associating with unauthorized tutors could jeopardize your standing. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Professor, Marcus spoke up, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to surprise Whitmore. Mathematics doesn't recognize credentials, only truth. How philosophical, she replied coldly. Unfortunately, Harvard recognizes credentials quite keenly. She turned to James. The competition is your final opportunity to demonstrate your mathematical competence. I suggest you seek legitimate assistance if you require it. After she left, silence settled over the room. She's right about one thing, James finally said. My scholarship is hanging by a thread. If I fail this competition. You won't fail, Marcus assured him, though concern lined his face. The following day, Marcus was scrubbing floors in the administration building when Dean Thompson approached, Professor Whitmore at his side. Johnson, the dean addressed him. A word. Marcus stood, respectfully removing his cleaning gloves. It's come to my attention that you've been engaging in unauthorized tutoring activities, Thompson began, his tone measured but stern. I've been helping a student understand mathematics, sir. That's not your role here, Thompson replied. We have qualified teaching assistants for that purpose. With respect, Dean Thompson, mathematics has always been Your position here is to maintain our facilities, Thompson interrupted. Not to involve yourself with our students' education. Consider this an official warning. As they walked away, Marcus heard Whitmore murmur, honestly, Richard, a janitor thinking he can teach Harvard-level mathematics. What's next? Later that afternoon, Olivia Chen approached Marcus as he cleaned the mathematics department hallway. Mr. Johnson, she said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. I need to talk to you. Marcus looked up, surprised by the intensity in her expression. I found something in the mathematics journal archives, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Papers from 20 years ago, authored by M.J. Osei. She held his gaze. That's you, isn't it? Dr. Osei. Marcus froze, his carefully constructed world threatening to unravel. Your work on multidimensional calculus was revolutionary, she pressed. It's still cited, though many don't realize. She hesitated. Professor Whitmore has been building on your foundations for years, though she's never acknowledged the original source. That was another life, Marcus replied carefully. Why are you here, working as a janitor, when you should be teaching in that classroom? Olivia demanded. Before Marcus could answer, James appeared at the end of the hallway, his face tight with anxiety. They've announced the competition problem areas, he said urgently. Whitmore's focusing on her specialty, the very field built on your work. Marcus looked between James and Olivia, then at the classroom door bearing Professor Whitmore's name. 2 decades of silence and invisibility hung in the balance against a young man's future and a truth long buried. We have 3 days, he said finally. Let's continue your preparation. Rain pattered against the windows of Marcus's apartment as he pulled a dusty box from beneath his bed. 20 years of careful self-effacement had taught him to keep his past hidden but never discarded. Inside lay his credentials, diplomas, academic awards, and most significantly, his groundbreaking papers on multidimensional calculus that had briefly made him a rising star in mathematics before American academics systematically discredited his work. He removed a faded photograph, a younger version of himself receiving an award at Imperial College London, his future seemingly limitless. Professor Gregory Whittaker, founder of the Whittaker Foundation now sponsoring the Harvard competition, stood beside him, beaming with pride at his protégé. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. James stood in the hallway, soaked from the rain. Sorry to come unannounced, he said. But after what happened with Whitmore and the dean, I needed to know if we're continuing. Marcus let him in, quickly returning the box to its hiding place. Sit, he offered, putting on water for tea. James noticed a framed equation on the wall, the only visible hint of Marcus's former life. That's your work, isn't it? The Osei transformation. Marcus nodded, handing him a towel for his wet hair. My last published theorem before everything changed. What exactly happened? James asked quietly. Olivia mentioned your work was revolutionary. Marcus sat heavily in his worn armchair, the weight of decades pressing upon him. In 1998, I published a paper extending Riemann's work on multidimensional spaces. It caused quite a stir, a mathematician from Ghana challenging established Western approaches. He paused, sipping his tea. 6 months later, 3 prominent American mathematicians published a joint refutation, claiming to find fundamental errors in my work. My reputation was destroyed overnight. Were there errors? James asked. No, Marcus replied simply. But that hardly mattered. Who would believe the African over Harvard's finest? Some suggested I had plagiarized, others that I simply didn't understand the deeper implications of my own work. So you just gave up? Marcus's eyes flashed. I fought. For 2 years, I submitted rebuttals, corrections, extensions of my work. Each was rejected without review. Meanwhile, my funding disappeared. My visa status became precarious. And you came here, to Harvard of all places. A sad smile crossed Marcus's face. Ironic, isn't it? I came to confront my detractors directly. But when I arrived, I discovered they were already building on my supposedly flawed work, extending it without attribution. That's academic theft, James said, anger rising in his voice. It's the reality of who gets to create knowledge and who doesn't, Marcus replied. I needed work. The janitorial position was available. And there was a certain, poetic justice in watching unseen as they taught my theories while erasing me from them. James leaned forward. But now they're using your own work as the basis for this competition. Work they claimed was flawed. Indeed. Eleanor Whitmore has built her entire career on the foundation they stole from me. You have to expose this, James insisted. Marcus shook his head. To what end? Who would believe the janitor? I would, came a voice from the doorway. Olivia stood there, having arrived during their conversation, the door left ajar in James's haste. I've been researching, she continued, stepping inside. Comparing your original papers with Whitmore's subsequent publications. The progression is undeniable. She's been refining your work while perpetuating the fiction that it was fundamentally flawed. She placed a folder on the table between them. The competition is based entirely on theoretical extensions of your original framework. James is expected to fail because Whitmore is withholding the key insights, your insights. Marcus stared at the folder, decades of resignation battling with a spark of long-dormant indignation. What would you have me do? He asked finally. Come to the competition, James said. Not to expose anything, just to be there. For moral support. Marcus looked between the two young faces before him, seeing in them the passion he had once possessed. I'll consider it, he said finally, knowing that after 20 years of invisibility, even that small step toward recognition felt like standing at the edge of an abyss. The mathematics department buzzed with activity as final preparations for the Whitaker competition were completed. Posters announced the prestigious event, highlighting the distinguished panel of judges, including Dean Thompson and visiting mathematicians from MIT and Princeton. Marcus moved methodically through the preparations, setting up chairs and cleaning whiteboards, his presence barely registered by the faculty members discussing last-minute details. Eleanor, are you certain about the competition problem? Dean Thompson asked Professor Whitmore as Marcus worked nearby. Even our graduate students found it nearly impossible to solve. That's precisely the point, Richard, she replied with satisfaction. The Whitaker Foundation expects us to identify truly exceptional talent. This will separate the merely competent from the truly brilliant. And you're convinced none of our undergraduates will succeed? A thin smile crossed her face. Perhaps one or two might stumble upon partial solutions. But complete mastery? Impossible without understanding certain theoretical underpinnings that aren't taught at the undergraduate level. Underpinnings she had appropriated from Marcus's work, never publicly acknowledging their source. Marcus continued his cleaning, the cloth moving in smooth, even strokes across the whiteboard, erasing equations as efficiently as his contributions had been erased from academic record. Later that evening, as most staff and students had left, Marcus encountered James in an empty classroom, slumped over his notes, visibly exhausted. You should rest before tomorrow, Marcus advised, setting aside his cleaning supplies. James looked up, dark circles under his eyes. I can't. Every approach I try hits a wall. It's like Whitmore designed this problem specifically to be unsolvable with the tools she's given us. That's exactly what she's done, Marcus confirmed. She's testing for knowledge she's never taught. James winced as he straightened, his back clearly causing him significant pain. Your back is worse, Marcus observed. Stress makes it flare up, James admitted. The doctor says I'm holding trauma in my body from what happened with Professor Harris. He attempted a smile. Apparently being physically assaulted by your professor leaves lasting effects. You should report what happened. James shook his head. Professor Harris has tenure and connections. I'm a scholarship student with unsubstantiated claims. Who do you think the university would believe? The question hung between them, both knowing the answer all too well. I've been meaning to ask, James said, changing the subject. Will you be there tomorrow? For the competition? Marcus hesitated. I'm not sure my presence would help your concentration. It would, James insisted. Just knowing someone believes in me. Their conversation was interrupted by the click of heels in the hallway. Professor Whitmore appeared in the doorway, her expression darkening at the sight of them together. Mr. Carter. Still seeking unorthodox assistance, I see. Just cleaning up, Professor, James replied, gathering his notes. Whitmore's gaze shifted to Marcus, something calculating in her eyes. Mr. Johnson. A moment. Marcus followed her into the hallway. I've been doing some research, she said without preamble. MJ Osei. That was you, wasn't it? Marcus remained impassive, but his heart raced. I'm not familiar with that name, Professor. Don't insult my intelligence, she hissed. Your work was fundamentally flawed, but it had potential. Potential others developed properly. She straightened. Whatever you think you're doing with Carter, it won't work. Some people simply don't belong in these hallowed halls, neither as students nor as supposed mathematical geniuses. As she walked away, Marcus stood motionless, her words washing over him like acid rain on stone, corrosive but no longer able to penetrate his core. When he returned to the classroom, James looked up questioningly. She knows who you are, James said, not really a question. She thinks she does, Marcus replied. But she has never truly seen me. James packed up his materials, moving stiffly. Will you come tomorrow? Marcus considered the layers of this question. Was he willing, after 20 years of invisibility, to step even slightly into the light? To witness this young man struggle against the same forces that had once driven him from academia? Yes, he said finally. I'll be there. But remember, your success or failure in this competition doesn't define your worth or your future. I know, James replied. But exposing the truth might change someone else's future. Maybe even yours. As they parted ways, Marcus found himself standing before a display case in the mathematics building, containing photographs of department luminaries. Professor Whitmore featured prominently, celebrated for breakthroughs in the very field Marcus had pioneered. For the first time in 20 years, the carefully constructed walls of his resignation began to crumble, revealing something he had long suppressed, not ambition, but a simple desire for truth to be acknowledged. The Whittaker Mathematics competition transformed Harvard's largest lecture hall into an academic battleground. Rows of individual desks replaced the usual seating, each supplied with blank paper, pencils, and a calculator. At the front, 3 massive blackboards waited, pristine and intimidating. University donors and mathematics faculty filled the observer section, their murmured conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. Dean Thompson moved among them, emphasizing Harvard's commitment to identifying and nurturing exceptional talent. James entered, immediately scanning the room for Marcus. He found him near the back wall, dressed in his janitorial uniform, mop in hand, present but maintaining his customary invisibility. Their eyes met briefly, Marcus offering a subtle nod of encouragement. Professor Whitmore strode to the center of the room, commanding immediate silence. Welcome to the Whittaker Foundation Mathematics Competition. Today's challenge represents the pinnacle of undergraduate mathematical exploration. Her gaze swept over the contestants, lingering pointedly on James. Some of you may find this beyond your capabilities. There is no shame in that. She gestured to the judges' panel. Your solutions will be evaluated by our distinguished colleagues from MIT and Princeton, as well as Harvard's own Dean Thompson. Olivia Chen, serving as competition assistant, distributed sealed packets to each participant. You have 3 hours, Professor Whitmore announced. You may begin. James opened his packet, his stomach dropping as he read the problem. It was, as Marcus had predicted, built upon theoretical frameworks that extended far beyond what undergraduates were taught, frameworks that originated in Marcus's uncredited work. Around him, other students appeared equally confounded. Some began tentative calculations, others stared blankly at the page. James closed his eyes, recalling Marcus's guidance: mathematics is a language with its own poetry. Listen for the rhythm beneath the symbols. For 2 hours, James worked steadily, pursuing an approach that synthesized Marcus's insights with standard techniques. He was making progress, but as the final hour approached, he hit an insurmountable obstacle, a theoretical leap that required knowledge Whitmore had never provided. Professor Whitmore circulated among the students, her expression revealing satisfaction at their collective struggle. When she reached James, she paused, examining his work with thinly veiled disdain. An interesting approach, Mr. Carter, she commented. Unconventional, but ultimately inadequate. James looked up, meeting her gaze directly. The solution requires understanding the Osei transformation, doesn't it? Something you've never taught us. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. Careful, Mr. Carter. Focus on your work, not on mathematical urban legends. As she moved away, James glanced toward Marcus, who had positioned himself near a side entrance, watching the proceedings with quiet intensity. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, James made a decision. He raised his hand. Professor Whitmore, I'd like to present my partial solution on the board. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. It was unusual for students to present before the competition concluded. That's not the protocol, Mr. Carter, she replied dismissively. Actually, Olivia interjected, consulting the rules, participants may present at any point if they believe they've reached a significant milestone or insight. Whitmore's jaw tightened, but with donors and visiting faculty watching, she could hardly refuse. Very well. You may use the center board. James approached the board, the familiar pain in his back intensifying with each step. He began writing, explaining his approach clearly for the judges. As he reached the critical juncture where his solution faltered, he paused. This is where conventional undergraduate mathematics fails to provide the necessary tools, he explained. The solution requires understanding a theoretical framework that's been systematically excluded from our curriculum. Professor Whitmore stepped forward. Mr. Carter, if you cannot complete the solution, I didn't say I couldn't complete it, James interrupted. I said it requires knowledge you've withheld. He turned to the judges. This problem is designed to be unsolvable with the tools we've been given. Dean Thompson frowned. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. It's not an accusation, James replied. It's a mathematical reality. The room fell silent, tension building like the pressure before a storm. From his position near the wall, Marcus watched the scene unfold, 2 decades of silence weighing against this moment of potential revelation. The silence in the lecture hall was absolute as James stood before the blackboard, his partial solution visible for all to see, brilliant but incomplete, like a bridge abruptly ending above a chasm. Mr. Carter, Dean Thompson said, breaking the tension, either complete your solution or return to your seat. This competition isn't a platform for complaints about curriculum. James looked out at the assembled faces, fellow students, distinguished faculty, visiting judges, all waiting for his failure. His gaze found Marcus at the back of the room, still and watchful. I cannot complete this solution, James admitted, because it requires knowledge of the OSE transformation, work that has been deliberately obscured from undergraduate students. Professor Whitmore stepped forward, her voice sharp with annoyance. This is absurd. The OSE papers were discredited decades ago. Their flaws were thoroughly documented by respected mathematicians. Were they? James challenged. Or was groundbreaking work dismissed because of who created it? That's enough, Whitmore snapped. You're embarrassing yourself and this institution. Perhaps this level of mathematics is simply beyond the capabilities of some students, regardless of how many diversity scholarships they receive. A murmur rippled through the audience at the naked prejudice in her words. James flinched as if struck, his back pain flaring with the public humiliation. At the back of the room, Marcus stood frozen, decades of practiced invisibility battling against rising indignation. He watched as James gathered his dignity despite Whitmore's barb, refusing to be diminished. The solution exists, James insisted, turning back to the board. But it requires acknowledging the validity of work that has been systematically erased. Theoretical fantasies, Whitmore dismissed. If you cannot complete the solution with accepted mathematical principles, then you have failed this challenge. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the room as Marcus set down his mop and began walking toward the front. Students turned to watch his approach, confusion giving way to curiosity. I believe I can assist with this solution, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying in the hushed hall. Dean Thompson frowned. Sir, this competition is closed to outside participants. I'm not an outside participant, Marcus replied. I'm a Harvard employee providing janitorial services. But I also happen to understand the mathematics in question. Professor Whitmore's face flushed with anger. This is completely inappropriate. Security, please remove this man. Wait, called one of the visiting judges from Princeton. I'd like to see where this goes. Marcus reached the blackboard, accepting a piece of chalk from James with a nod of thanks. He studied the partial solution for a moment, then began to write, his hand moving with practiced confidence. The equation flowered under his touch, expanding into elegant structures that connected previously disparate elements of James's work. The chalk clicked against the board in a steady rhythm, the sound of mathematical poetry being composed in real time. The room watched in stunned silence as this supposed janitor transformed an incomplete solution into a mathematical symphony, revealing pathways that even the judges hadn't considered. "This isn't possible," Whitmore whispered, her composure cracking as she recognized formulations she had claimed as her own innovations appearing under Marcus's hand. When he finally stepped back from the board, the solution stood complete, undeniable in its elegance and precision. "The approach utilizes what was once called the Osei transformation," Marcus explained, addressing the judges directly. "It allows for movement between dimensional frameworks in a way that resolves the apparent paradox in the original problem." The Osei papers were discredited, Dean Thompson objected, though uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Were they?" Marcus asked quietly. "Or were they simply inconvenient to those who wished to build upon them without attribution?" The Princeton judge had risen from his seat, approaching the board with growing excitement. "This is remarkable," he said, examining the solution. "I've only seen theoretical applications of this approach in recent papers by." He glanced at Professor Whitmore, understanding dawning on his face. "Who are you?" the MIT judge asked Marcus directly. Marcus straightened, 20 years of invisibility falling away as he reclaimed his identity. "My name is Dr. Moylee Johnson Osei. 20 years ago, I published the foundational papers on multidimensional calculus that this solution employs, papers that were systematically discredited by this institution." A stunned silence fell over the room, broken only by the soft sound of chalk dust settling on the ledge of the blackboard. "That's impossible," Whitmore sputtered. "Osei disappeared years ago. This is some kind of elaborate hoax." "Not a hoax, Professor," Olivia stepped forward, holding a folder. "I've compared Dr. Osei's original papers with subsequent publications. The mathematical lineage is unmistakable." The Princeton judge stared at Marcus with dawning recognition. "I remember those papers from my graduate studies. They were revolutionary. We were told they contained fundamental errors, but no one ever specified what those errors were." "Because there were none," Marcus replied simply. "Only the inconvenient fact of their origin." In the audience, an elderly gentleman rose slowly to his feet, Professor Emeritus Gregory Whittaker himself, founder of the Whittaker Foundation and former mentor to Marcus at Imperial College. "Moylee," he said, his voice quavering with emotion. "Is it truly you?" The Whittaker competition had transformed into something entirely unexpected, a long-delayed reckoning. Professor Whittaker made his way slowly to the front of the lecture hall, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "My God," he said when he reached the podium. "We thought you had returned to Ghana. Your brilliance simply vanished from the mathematical world." "Not vanished," Marcus replied quietly. "Just rendered invisible. I've been here at Harvard for 15 years, watching as my work was systematically built upon while my name was erased from the record." The room hummed with shocked whispers as the implications sank in. Professor Whitmore stood rigid, her face a mask of controlled panic. "This is preposterous," she insisted. "Even if this man was once Osei, his work was thoroughly reviewed and found wanting by respected mathematicians." "By you and your colleagues, Eleanor," Whittaker corrected, his voice hardening. "I never believed those refutations, but I couldn't prove they were motivated by prejudice rather than mathematical rigor." He turned to Marcus. "I searched for you, my boy. For years. I didn't want to be found," Marcus admitted. "After the systematic dismantling of my reputation, I chose a different path. One where I could observe without being observed." Dean Thompson cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the unfolding situation. "This is all very dramatic, but it doesn't change the fact that this competition has been compromised." "On the contrary," the the Princeton judge intervened. "We've just witnessed something extraordinary, the solution to a problem specifically designed to be unsolvable without knowledge deliberately withheld from students." He gestured to James. This young man recognized the theoretical gap and identified its source. That demonstrates mathematical insight of the highest order. James stood beside Marcus, his posture straighter despite his pain, his expression reflecting the vindication of a truth long suppressed. "The competition was compromised from its inception," Olivia added, her voice steady despite her junior status among these academic powers. "It was designed as a test no student could pass without access to knowledge Professor Whitmore has claimed as her own while systematically excluding its true origins." Professor Whitaker examined the completed solution on the blackboard, his experienced eyes following the elegant pathways Marcus had revealed. "This is undeniably your work, Moyali. The same brilliant insights I recognized 20 years ago." He turned to face the assembled crowd, his voice gaining strength. "As founder of the Whitaker Foundation, I declare James Carter the winner of this competition. His mathematical insight led him to recognize the deliberate gap in the provided tools, and his intellectual honesty led him to acknowledge its source." Professor Whitmore stepped forward, desperation breaking through her composure. "Gregory, you can't seriously." "I can and I do," he interrupted firmly. "Furthermore, I will be initiating a complete review of all publications that build upon Dr. Osei's foundational work, with proper attribution to be restored." The donors in attendance, witnessing this academic drama unfold, murmured among themselves. One prominent alumnus raised his hand. "If Dr. Osei has indeed been at Harvard all this time, working as a janitor, while his intellectual contributions were appropriated, this raises serious ethical questions about the institution." Dean Thompson, recognizing the threat to Harvard's reputation and donor relationships, quickly adopted a conciliatory tone. The university would, of course, welcome a full investigation and is committed to academic integrity. In the back of the room, students had begun searching Dr. Osei's name on their phones, discovering his early brilliant career and its abrupt end. "Dr. Osei," Dean Thompson continued, addressing Marcus directly, "Harvard would be privileged to discuss how we might rectify this unfortunate situation." Marcus regarded him steadily. 20 years of intellectual erasure is not an unfortunate situation, Dean Thompson. It is systematic academic theft motivated by prejudice. "Nevertheless," Thompson pressed, "we should discuss your future at Harvard." "Yes," Marcus replied. "We should. But first, I believe Mr. Carter deserves formal recognition for his achievement today." James stepped forward, accepting the Whitaker Foundation medal from Professor Whitaker himself. As applause filled the room, he turned to Marcus. "This belongs to you," he said quietly, attempting to hand over the medal. Marcus shook his head. "No. You earned this by recognizing truth when others insisted on falsehood. That is the essence of scientific progress." 3 months after the dramatic events of the Whitaker competition, the Harvard Mathematics Department had undergone significant changes. Professor Whitmore had taken an extended sabbatical, following a review of her publications, which found numerous instances of unattributed incorporation of Dr. Osei's work. The spring semester brought new faces to the faculty, most notably Dr. Moyali Johnson Osei, now installed as a visiting professor of theoretical mathematics while a permanent position was being negotiated. His first lecture had drawn students from across the university, the hall filled beyond capacity with young minds eager to learn from the mathematician whose brilliant career had been interrupted but never truly extinguished. James Carter sat in the front row, his back pain significantly improved through proper medical treatment and the reduction of academic anxiety. Beside him sat Olivia Chen, recently appointed as Dr. Osei's teaching assistant. As Marcus, now publicly Dr. Osei, wrote an elegant equation on the board, James reflected on how much had changed. The Princeton judge had become his mentor, impressed by his mathematical intuition. The Whitaker Foundation had expanded its mission to include addressing systemic barriers in academic mathematics. And Dr. Osei's early papers had been republished in leading journals, with editorial notes acknowledging the historical injustice of their initial reception. Mathematics, Dr. Osei was saying to the rapt audience, is often presented as the most objective of disciplines, free from the biases that plague other fields. Yet even here, we must acknowledge that human prejudices shape whose contributions are valued and whose are dismissed. He turned from the board to face his students directly. The equation before you represents more than a mathematical truth. It represents the principle that knowledge belongs to humanity, not to institutions or individuals who claim the privilege of defining it. After class, Dr. Osei and James walked across Harvard Yard together, their path taking them past the building where they had first connected, Marcus as a janitor, James as a struggling student. "Have you decided about the Oxford offer?" Marcus asked. James nodded. "I'm accepting their graduate fellowship. Professor Whitaker has agreed to serve as my advisor." "An excellent choice," Marcus approved. "Your approach to the modified Chandrasekhar formulation showed remarkable creativity." They paused by the steps where, months earlier, James had stood in pain, unable to sit in Eleanor Whitmore's class. "How's your back?" Marcus asked gently. "Better," James replied. "The doctor says the physical therapy is working, but the biggest improvement came from no longer feeling threatened in classrooms." Marcus nodded in understanding. Some wounds are inflicted by more than just physical trauma. A group of students passed by, recognizing Dr. Osei and greeting him with respect, a far cry from the invisibility of his janitorial days. "Do you ever miss it?" James asked. "The anonymity?" Marcus considered this. "Sometimes. There was a certain freedom in being unseen. But there is greater freedom still in being truly seen and acknowledged." They continued their walk, two mathematicians discussing elegant equations and future possibilities, equal in their pursuit of truth that transcended prejudice and preconception. In a nearby building, a custodian pushed his cart past them, nodding in recognition to Dr. Osei, a silent acknowledgement between those who understood that dignity resided in the person, not the position. Marcus returned the nod with equal respect, remembering that some of the most important lessons of his life had come during those years of invisible service. "The universe," Dr. Osei remarked as they continued their journey, "like mathematics, doesn't care about our human hierarchies. Truth remains truth, whether spoken by a professor or whispered by the person who cleans the halls after everyone else has gone home." James smiled, recognizing in those words the essence of what his mentor had taught him, that true education begins with the courage to see beyond appearances, to recognize brilliance wherever it exists, and to stand firm in defense of truth, even when standing alone. Dear friend, true brilliance can't remain hidden forever. This story reminds us that dignity resides in a person, not their position, and that we must challenge systems that silence voices based on prejudice rather than merit. Every day, countless individuals have their contributions minimized, appropriated, or erased simply because of who they are. By recognizing and amplifying these overlooked voices, we create a world where excellence is celebrated regardless of its source. Remember Marcus and James when you encounter someone society has rendered invisible. Their story might just change your perspective forever. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives that challenge prejudice and celebrate human dignity.